Barry, the concept of possible worlds sounds like it's science fiction, different worlds out there that we don't know about. But the concept is very powerful in philosophy as a mechanism for determining so-called modality, what's necessary, what's contingent, what may be there, or what has to be there. It's also used in physics. We're at this conference on fine-tuning in physics in Crete, and we see it used here in terms of the different possible universes that can or cannot have life in them based on certain characteristics. One of the most famous examples of possible worlds is somebody whom you've worked with, who I never met, sadly, David Lewis. And I've read his book, and it brings a smile to your face, because this sounds ridiculous. What he called modal realism, that every possible world that's conceivable, or I don't know how to define it, really exists somewhere, not in our spatio-temporal. You know, is that as ridiculous as it sounds?
So I don't think it's ridiculous. There is this. Lewis said that when he put forward his view, it was usually greeted not with arguments against it, but what he called an incredulous stare. I understand that. I also thought about it when I first started working. I was not a student of Lewis, though I did know him a little bit, but was working with another philosopher who also was at the groundwork with possible worlds, but had a very different idea about how to think of them. A Finnish philosopher called Jaakko Hintikka. So I thought that Lewis was nuts, like maybe people think. But over time, I've come to appreciate better why he has the view that he has, and it doesn't seem to me to be so crazy. And while I think his reason for introducing possible worlds and using them, and the reason that they've come to be so important in analytic philosophy, is very, very different from the reason that came up in some of the fine-tuning literature, and in cosmology, and in the so-called Everett interpretation of quantum mechanics. And it's important not to confuse these different uses of the phrase universe or possible worlds or whatever.
So distinguish those two.
Yeah, okay, so let me just make a distinction. In what Lewis was interested in was philosophical analyses or explications of, as you were saying, notions of modality. Phrases like, it's metaphysically necessary that 2 + 2 = 4, that 7 + 5 = 12. Some kinds of statements, particularly those in mathematics are very good examples, strike us as such that they're not just true, but they have to be true. Other statements strike us as they're true, but they didn't have to be true. So, for example, that Donald Trump won the election in 2016. It was true, but it didn't have to be true. We could have imagined how things could have worked out differently so that he didn't win the election. Some philosophers think that all truths have to be true. Spinoza might have thought that. Most philosophers think, though, that there's this real distinction. And the idea of there being all these possible worlds also is very useful in giving an account of the nature of what are called propositions, or also properties in philosophy, and of what's called the logic of propositions, or the logic of certain kinds of statements like counterfactuals, and the logic of probability statements. So counterfactuals, for example, are statements like this: if you had not struck the match, it would not have lit. That might be true. Well, why is it true? Well, Lewis says that that's true just in case in certain class of worlds which are very similar to the actual world, in which you strike the match, but you didn't strike the match, it lights. Okay. Now, it's important to understand that Lewis didn't think that what's going on in some other possible world makes the counterfactual true. He thought what makes the counterfactual true is some fact that occurs in the actual world, certain patterns of events in the actual world. But what he also thought is that there's a way of capturing those patterns by talking about what goes on in other possible worlds. That's a rather subtle distinction, but it's an interesting one. So Lewis and many other philosophers who don't share Lewis's view about what possible worlds are think that possible worlds are very useful in philosophy. In physics, worlds come in because there's a theory which says, here's how things happen in our world. For example, in order to explain certain features of the early universe, why the universe has a certain geometry. The geometry is very what's called flat or Euclidean so the spatial geometry of the early universe is close to being Euclidean, where it could have been all crinkled up in various ways. Well, there's a theory called inflation, which says that the universe expanded at an unbelievable accelerated rate for a very short amount of time at the beginning. This flattened it out. But it turns out that inflation seems to have the consequence that as inflation proceeds, it never stops everywhere. It always continues. And it's because it's continuing at such an incredible rate, it produces bigger and bigger regions of space, which then themselves produce little universes. And so little what I call pocket universes fall out of this. These universes are really thought of as being physically real in the totality of space and time, though each one also has its own space-time within it, but there's a big space and time that contains all of these universes, but that's part of a scientific theory. That's not Lewis's motivation. And where Lewis has any possible world in which anything that doesn't conflict with what's necessarily true, the truths of metaphysics, there's some possible world in which it's true, whereas in the inflationary multiverse, all the universes that occur have to obey the fundamental physical laws. So there are many more universes in Lewis's realm than in the multiverse realm of inflation. Now, Lewis has his particular view about worlds. He thinks that they are concrete totalities. Most philosophers who think about possible worlds think about them not as concrete totalities, but rather as something like stories or propositions, which are the contents of stories. So any consistent story would correspond to a possible world, as long as it answered every question that you could ask within the vocabulary of that story. So they're sort of complete in that respect. That's a view.